framed, betrayed, silenced. Kiana Moore thought she had seen injustice before, but nothing prepared her for this. With the legal system turned against her, can she prove her innocence before it's too late? Kiana Moore had spent years building her reputation as a woman of integrity. Every morning, she walked into the headquarters of Harvest Hands, a nonprofit organization committed to feeding underprivileged families across Washington, D.C. Her work was her pride, a mission that gave her life meaning. She managed donations, organized food drives, and worked tirelessly to ensure that struggling families had meals on their tables. But in a single moment, her world unraveled. As she stepped out of the office one evening, the crisp autumn air wrapping around her, she noticed a police car parked across the street. She barely gave it a second thought, until the flashing red and blue lights flickered on, illuminating the sidewalk beneath her feet. "Kiana Moore," a stern voice called out. Startled, she turned to find two officers approaching with rigid postures. Officer Daniel Mills, tall and broad-shouldered, led the way, his expression unreadable. Beside him, Officer Ava Rios clutched a file, flipping through its contents with sharp precision. "Yes?" Kiana replied, confusion clouding her face. Mills didn't hesitate. "You're under investigation for financial fraud and identity theft." The words hit her like a sledgehammer. Her heart pounded as the weight of the accusation settled over her. "What? That's ridiculous. I don't even—" "Turn around, ma'am," Rios ordered, her voice flat, professional. "You need to come with us." Kiana instinctively took a step back, her mind racing. "This has to be a mistake. I haven't done anything wrong." Mills didn't blink. "We have evidence linking you to stolen funds from multiple donors. We need to process you downtown." Panic surged through her veins. Stolen funds? From Harvest Hands? It was unfathomable. She had poured everything into that organization, ensuring transparency and ethical practices. The mere thought of being accused of theft made her stomach churn. "Wait, I work there. I handle donations. I would never steal from—" Cold metal clamped around her wrists. The sharp click of the handcuffs made her flinch. Pedestrians slowed, watching the scene unfold. Some whispered, others pulled out their phones. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Please," she pleaded. "Check your facts. This is wrong." Mills guided her toward the police car, his grip firm but not aggressive. "You'll have your chance to explain everything at the station." Kiana's body stiffened as she was placed in the back seat, the door shutting with a finality that sent chills down her spine. As the car pulled away from the curb, the city lights blurred past her. The world continued as if nothing had happened, while her life was being turned upside down. Someone had set her up. And whoever it was, they wanted to see her fall. The cold, unforgiving walls of the holding cell surrounded Kiana, pressing in on her like a suffocating weight. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the small space she was confined to. Her heart pounded as she paced, her mind racing through every possible explanation. How could this be happening? She had asked to call her mother the moment she arrived at the station, but the officers dismissed her request. "Not until processing is complete," they had said, their expressions void of sympathy. Hours turned into an entire night, and still, she had no contact with the outside world. The silence, the uncertainty, it gnawed at her, making sleep impossible. By the second day, exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. She had barely eaten, and every time an officer passed, she asked the same question. "Can I call my mother now?" Each time, the answer remained the same. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the heavy iron door creaked open. A man in a navy suit, holding a folder in one hand and adjusting his glasses with the other, stepped inside. "Kiana Moore?" She shot up from the bench, desperation in her voice. "Yes, please, I need help." The man offered a reassuring nod. "I'm Max Williams, your public defender." Relief washed over her, but it was fleeting. Max's expression was serious as he pulled out a chair and gestured for her to sit. "Listen, Kiana, I just finished reviewing the case. They claim to have strong evidence against you. Witness statements, bank records showing missing funds linked to your credentials." This is serious. Her breath hitched. But I didn't do anything. Someone must have set me up. Max leaned forward. I believe you. But belief isn't enough in court. We need proof. The charges are heavy, and if we don't fight this right, you could be looking at real prison time. Kiana's stomach twisted at the thought. She had never even imagined stepping foot inside a courtroom, let alone being on trial. Here's the good news, Max continued. I argued for bail, and it was granted. You'll be released today, but the trial date is set. That means we have a limited window to build your defense. Kiana exhaled sharply, trying to process everything. How much time do we have? Not enough, Max admitted. But we'll use every second. The next few hours passed in a blur. She signed papers, went through final processing, and retrieved her belongings, her phone, now dead, and her house keys. The moment she stepped outside the station, the evening air hit her, cold and biting. Her mother was already there, waiting near the entrance, tears in her eyes. Kiana rushed into her arms, feeling a deep ache in her chest. This wasn't over. Not even close. She had a fight ahead, and she wouldn't stop until the truth came out. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the trial commenced. Every seat was occupied. Reporters, legal analysts, and curious spectators had gathered, eager to witness the unfolding case. Kiana sat beside Max, her fingers gripping the edge of the defense table. Across from her, the prosecution team, led by Assistant District Attorney Heather Lang, was already preparing their opening arguments. Lang wasted no time painting Kiana as the central figure in a sophisticated credit card fraud scheme. She spoke with confidence, describing an elaborate operation where stolen identities were allegedly used to funnel thousands of dollars into fraudulent accounts. Ms. Moore orchestrated a scheme that exploited financial institutions, small businesses, and unsuspecting individuals, Lang declared, gesturing toward the jury. The evidence will prove her involvement beyond a shadow of a doubt. The first witness took the stand, a financial analyst from one of the affected banks. He reviewed account records, pointing out suspicious transactions tied to an email address supposedly linked to Kiana. His words were precise, but as Max listened, he noted something important. The records did not prove Kiana had access to those accounts, only that her name appeared somewhere in the digital trail. Next came shop owners who had allegedly suffered losses due to the scam. They nodded when asked if they recognized Kiana's face. Their identification, however, was based entirely on images provided by the police, not personal encounters. Max knew this was a weak link, suggestive at best, but hardly conclusive. Then came Officer Daniel Mills, the lead investigator. Taking his seat on the witness stand, he exuded confidence. His voice was steady as he detailed months of investigations that, in his words, repeatedly led back to Ms. Moore. He described surveillance efforts, flagged transactions, and supposed patterns that placed Kiana at the center of the operation. Her credentials surfaced in nearly every case we examined, he asserted, addressing the jury directly. Max stood for cross-examination, adjusting his tie before stepping forward. Officer Mills, you mentioned that Ms. Moore's name appeared in multiple reports. Can you confirm whether any of those instances link her directly to illegal activity, rather than simply being part of a broader data set? Mills hesitated for the first time, his confidence flickering. The patterns suggest, Max cut in. I asked for direct evidence, not suggestions. The tension in the room thickened. Then, Officer Ava Rios was called. Unlike Mills, she appeared uneasy. Her eyes darted toward Kiana before shifting away. As the prosecutor guided her through questions, her responses were clipped, lacking conviction. When Max took over, he leaned in slightly. Officer Rios, are you absolutely certain that Ms. Moore committed these crimes? A pause, a flicker of doubt. Her voice, barely above a whisper, broke the silence. I think so. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Kiana's heart pounded. For the first time, cracks were forming in the prosecution's case, and Max was ready to break them wide open. The courtroom tension was suffocating, every second stretching longer than the last. Max Williams had spent his entire career fighting for justice, but something about this case felt different. Manufactured, manipulated. Then, a quiet moment changed everything. A court clerk, avoiding eye contact, slipped him a folded note as he gathered his files. Confused, Max unfolded it. 4 words leaped off the page. Sealed affidavits exist. Unseen. His pulse quickened. What evidence had been deliberately kept out of reach? Without hesitation, he rose. Your Honor, I am filing a motion to unseal all affidavits related to this case. The prosecution has presented a narrative that appears carefully controlled. If exculpatory evidence exists, it must be reviewed immediately. Ada Heather Lang objected. That is highly irregular. Judge Monroe raised a hand, silencing her. Mr. Williams approached the bench. Documents were brought forward. The judge's expression darkened as she read, her fingers gripping the pages a little too tightly. She inhaled sharply before lowering the affidavits onto her desk. These statements should have been disclosed. Her voice was firm, her displeasure evident. She turned to the prosecution. I want an explanation. Lang hesitated, flipping through her files as though searching for a lifeline. Your Honor, we were proceeding based on the most credible evidence available at the time. The judge cut her off. Not good enough. She turned to Max. Proceed. Max wasted no time. The affidavits reveal that multiple witnesses were influenced, pressured, into identifying Ms. Moore as the prime suspect. The police provided descriptions, photos, and led these individuals toward a predetermined conclusion. This is not evidence. It's coercion. A ripple of whispers spread through the gallery. Jurors shifted, taking in this revelation. Max walked to the witness stand, his expression unreadable as he locked eyes with Officer Eva Rios. Officer Rios, were you aware of these affidavits? Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. She hesitated. Answer the question, he pressed, voice controlled but sharp. Finally, she exhaled. Yes. A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Max took a slow step forward. Did you or Officer Mills encourage witnesses to identify my client, despite lacking concrete proof of her involvement? Rios looked down at her hands. Then she nodded. The case was rushed. We had pressure to close it. Silence. Heavy. Condemning. Heather Lang's face paled as the weight of the revelation crashed over the prosecution's case. Kiana's fingers trembled against the table. She had spent days trapped in fear, accused of something she didn't do. And now, finally, the truth was breaking free. Max turned to the judge. Your Honor, the foundation of this case is crumbling. The defense moves for immediate reconsideration of all charges. The judge folded her hands. We are entering new territory. We will resume after a full review. For the first time, Kiana had hope. A sudden shift in the air sent ripples through the tense courtroom. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and in stepped a man radiating quiet authority. Dressed in a dark suit, his sharp gaze scanned the room before locking onto the judge. The murmurs in the gallery hushed almost instantly. Your Honor, the bailiff announced. Secret Service agent Robert Mitchell requests permission to address the court. Heather Lang's face paled. The unexpected arrival sent a visible shudder through the prosecution's table. Judge Monroe, raising an intrigued brow, nodded. Proceed. Mitchell approached with measured steps, placing a thick dossier on the evidence table. Agent Mitchell, U.S. Secret Service. We have been conducting a separate investigation into high-level financial fraud involving multiple individuals. My team uncovered critical information that directly pertains to Ms. Moore's case. Max Williams leaned forward, eyes narrowing. And what exactly did you find, Agent Mitchell? The agent opened the file and projected surveillance footage onto the courtroom screen. The grainy black-and-white video showed a woman withdrawing cash from an ATM. Someone who bore an uncanny resemblance to Kiana. Gasps erupted from the spectators. Lang smirked. That looks like our defendant. Mitchell remained unfazed. That's what the real culprit wanted everyone to believe. He clicked to the next frame, revealing clearer footage of the same woman entering a building. The timestamp and location were miles away from where Kiana had been at the time. Then, he pulled up a forensic report. IP logs from fraudulent transactions were traced to a remote server out of state. Meanwhile, Ms. Moore's verified locations, via phone GPS, security check-ins, and personal witnesses, place her nowhere near these crimes when they occurred. The courtroom collectively leaned in, the weight of this revelation sending a shockwave through the proceedings. Max turned to the jury. What this means, ladies and gentlemen, is that Kiana Moore is not the mastermind behind a fraud ring. She is its victim. Lang scrambled to regain control. Your Honor, this evidence was not previously disclosed. The judge held up a hand. That's because the defense was never given a fair chance to review all materials. Her gaze hardened. And now, we will. Mitchell continued, unfazed by the prosecution's resistance. We have already identified multiple suspects connected to this scheme. Ms. Moore's credentials were stolen and used without her knowledge. Silence blanketed the courtroom as the realization settled in. The entire foundation of the case had been obliterated. The judge took a slow breath before addressing the prosecution. Ms. Lang, given this new evidence, I strongly suggest you reconsider your stance. Heather Lang hesitated, her grip tightening around her pen. She had lost. Kiana inhaled deeply, disbelief and relief washing over her in waves. After everything, the truth had finally found its voice. Max smirked. Well, that changes everything, doesn't it? The courtroom sat in absolute silence as Judge Delacroix shuffled the final set of papers before looking up. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone. Across the room, Ada Heather Lang sat stiffly, her jaw clenched, knowing there was no way to salvage what remained of her shattered case. She had lost. The court finds that the prosecution has failed to provide substantial evidence linking Ms. Moore to these crimes, Judge Delacroix announced, her voice steady but firm. Therefore, all charges against the defendant are hereby dropped. A collective gasp rippled through the spectators. Relief crashed over Kiana like a tidal wave. She blinked rapidly, trying to absorb the words she had been desperate to hear. Max Williams patted her shoulder, whispering, "It's over." But for Kiana, this was just the beginning. Judge Delacroix wasn't finished. Furthermore, the court orders an immediate investigation into the conduct of the officers involved in this case. The handling of this matter raises serious concerns regarding ethics and due process. Her piercing gaze shifted toward Officer Mills, who sat rigidly at the back of the courtroom. His confidence had long since vanished. Officer Daniel Mills, given the inconsistencies in your testimony and your involvement in pressuring witnesses, you will be subject to an internal review. The color drained from his face. In contrast, Ava Rios, who had already unraveled on the stand, looked resigned. When Judge Delacroix's gaze fell on her, she didn't even attempt to defend herself. Instead, she lowered her head, her decision already made. I've submitted my resignation, Your Honor, she admitted quietly. The judge nodded approvingly. That is the right course of action. Meanwhile, Heather Lang's entire career stood on shaky ground. The headlines had already begun circulating, detailing how the prosecution had withheld key evidence, relied on coerced statements, and ignored the possibility of police misconduct. Her future in the district attorney's office was now in question, and she knew it. As the gavel struck the bench one final time, signaling the official close of the case, Kiana rose from her seat. The moment felt surreal. For days, she had lived under the crushing weight of false accusations, staring down a future she didn't deserve. Now, she was free. Walking out of the courthouse, she took her first deep breath in what felt like forever. The press swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones shoved toward her. "Kiana, what will you do now?" one reporter asked eagerly. She squared her shoulders, her voice unwavering. "I will fight. For justice. For the ones who don't have a voice. No one should go through what I did." Max grinned. "Looks like we're just getting started." And with that, Kiana Moore stepped into her new purpose. Not as a victim, but as a force for change. Kiana Moore refused to fade into the background. Her name had once been dragged through the mud, but now it carried a different weight. One that demanded accountability. Within weeks of her exoneration, She filed a lawsuit against the city and police department, holding them responsible for the wrongful arrest, the fabricated evidence, and the irreparable damage done to her reputation. She wasn't just seeking compensation, she was demanding change. The case gained national attention. Civil rights groups, legal experts, and activists rallied behind her, amplifying her voice. News stations ran segments dissecting the failures of the justice system, using Kiana's experience as a case study in systemic bias. The pressure mounted. The city had no choice but to settle. But money was never Kiana's goal. As part of the agreement, the police department was forced to implement reforms. Officers underwent mandatory training on ethical investigations, and new guidelines were introduced to prevent wrongful identifications. Witness coercion, once an overlooked tactic, now carried severe penalties. For Kiana, this wasn't a victory. It was just the first step. She used her platform to ignite a movement. Invitations poured in for her to speak at universities, conferences, and legal summits. Standing before crowds of students, lawyers, and policymakers, she shared her experience, not as a cautionary tale, but as a call to action. Innocent people are trapped in a system that's built to break them, she told one audience. If I had no legal support, no access to the right people, where would I be right now? Locked up, forgotten. The room had gone silent. Every word struck like a hammer. Kiana's voice carried weight beyond the stage. She lobbied for policy reforms that would make wrongful convictions harder to ignore. She pushed for independent oversight committees to investigate law enforcement misconduct. The impact of her fight reached beyond her city, influencing national conversations on judicial fairness. But it wasn't just legal minds who listened. The people heard her too. Communities began organizing, demanding transparency from local governments. Social media campaigns spread awareness, echoing Kiana's message. One injustice exposed is another prevented. She never asked to be an activist. She never wanted the spotlight. But now that she had it, she refused to waste it. Her story stood as a warning, a stark reminder of how quickly an innocent person could be railroaded by a flawed system. But more importantly, it became a symbol of resilience, proof that one voice, no matter how small at first, could shake the foundations of power and demand justice. Kiana had once been a defendant, fighting to prove her innocence. Now, she was a warrior, fighting for those who never got the chance. And she wasn't stopping anytime soon. Kiana Moore had won her battle, but the war was far from over. Justice had been served in her case, yet she knew countless others still sat behind bars, wrongfully accused, unheard, forgotten. She refused to let her victory be just another news headline. As she stepped out of the courthouse, the weight of her struggle finally lifted. But in its place, a new burden took shape. A responsibility she could not ignore. She had survived the system. Now she had to change it. Walking down those marble steps, she felt a wave of emotions crash over her. Relief, rage, resolve. The relief of freedom, the rage at the system that tried to break her, and the resolve to make sure no one else would suffer the way she did. Her name had once been dragged through the mud. Now, it was a symbol of resistance. With every step forward, her purpose became clearer. She would be more than a survivor. She would be a force. The cameras flashed, reporters shouting questions, but Kiana didn't need to answer them. Her actions would speak louder than any soundbite. She wasn't just walking away from injustice. She was walking toward change. In the weeks that followed, she poured herself into action. She met with wrongfully convicted individuals, sat in on policy discussions, and pushed for legal reforms that held law enforcement accountable. The laws that failed her needed to be rewritten. She spoke where people listened. Universities, courtrooms, grassroots movements. She shared her story not for sympathy, but for change. Innocent people don't just get accused, she told a packed auditorium. They get buried alive by a system designed to silence them. That stops now. Her voice carried beyond the room. The legal world took notice. Cases like hers were reviewed with renewed scrutiny. False accusations once brushed aside were now being challenged and exposed. She became more than an activist. She became a catalyst. But through all of it, She never forgot the night she was arrested. The cold metal of handcuffs, the helplessness in that cell. That memory fueled her. It reminded her why she could never stop fighting. One case had nearly destroyed her. Now she was saving lives with every battle she won. Kiana Moore had once been a victim of the system. Now, she was its reckoning.